Hello, hello, everyone. It is so good to see you. How's everyone doing today? Welcome to our first Lead Grow Deepen of 2024. Head on over to the chat box. Let us know where you're calling in from. Let's see who we have so far. We've got Atlanta. We have Columbus. Hello from Massachusetts, Los Angeles, Boulder, Council Bluffs. Awesome. Well, yeah, continue to write in, say hello to your fellow team members. We'd love to hear from you over there. It's good to see all of you. My name is Lauren Beckwith. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a program manager for food experiences at ISS Guckenheimer. Welcome again to our very first Lead Grow Deepen of 2024. As you are joining, remember to head on over to the chat box to say hi to your fellow team members across our organization. Let us know where you're calling in from. And also, don't be shy. Use that chat box throughout this event. If you have any comments or questions, pop them in there. I do want to remind everyone that our Lead Grow Deepen speaker series features both internal and external subject matter experts in the food and hospitality industry. Now, if there's someone that you want to hear from, please reach out to us, drop a comment in the chat, let us know the topics, the speakers that you want to hear more about. For those joining for the very first time, the goal of this series is to highlight the ways that we and other industry professionals lead with inclusion, grow diverse representation, and deepen our industry partnerships. Later in the talk, we're going to revisit representation and how honoring cultures and traditions can play a significant role in the transformation of our food system. Today, we are super lucky to learn from Rebecca Chesney, who is a globally recognized sustainability and innovation leader with over 13 years of experience building a better future. Trained in food anthropology, strategic foresight, and design methods, Rebecca understands the nuances of the global food system and helps others navigate its complexity to drive change. So everyone, please give me a super big hand in welcoming Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I was just in Atlanta last week, so I love seeing some people calling in from Atlanta. So love to see people from all over. So thank you for having me.
Of course. Okay, so let's just dive in and start talking food. Now, if you had to choose a favorite ingredient, what would it be and why?
It was such a hard question for me to answer because I pretty much love everything. But the food that immediately comes to my mind in terms of what I think captures me and my life, it's actually kind of two ingredients.
Okay.
Years ago, I was in Rome over New Year's Eve with a friend of mine is from there, and her father asked me, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would you live? And I don't know why, it just came to me. I said, where lemons and olives grow. And turns out that has actually described my life. I grew up in Texas. I lived in Texas for 21 years of my life, which is, there are olives in Texas, but it's not really, I didn't grow up around lemons and olives, but in my adult life, that's where I've lived. I lived in California. I lived here for about 12 years. In my last house, I had a lemon tree in my backyard, which was, I would have dreamed of that. And my partner is from Italy. So I actually spend a lot of time in Italy, and I very much adopt a Mediterranean style of cooking and eating. And so you will always find lemons in my kitchen. I use them very, very often to brighten the dish and to bake. So I would say lemons really capture one of my favorite ingredients, but lemons and olives, where those two things grow, is where the sun shines. It's where my favorite cuisines are, in those places.
Beautiful. I love that so much. So now your background, food anthropology, I think, that might be an area of study that folks aren't super familiar with. So would you just give us like a super brief description of like, what is food anthropology? And is this something that was like a calling to you, or did you sort of find this field?
Well, I always, when I'm speaking to people that are just entering, finishing high school and trying to figure out what they want to do next, I always say, don't worry about having it all figured out, because your career path could very well be very windy, which mine is. I was pre-med, and then I studied accounting and finance. I was a CPA at a time. So I do love a good spreadsheet. I haven't kept that active, but I was a CPA. But I've always had this, I think, this interest in people and curiosity, and always had this interest in food. I grew up next door to my grandparents. My grandmother was the kind of person that someone shows up and she could whip up a delicious meal. So I grew up with food being kind of a core part of the way my family interacted. But it wasn't until I was in my 20s, there were a few things. One is around the time that the conversation around food, especially in the US, was shifting. I read some Michael Pollan books, and I started seeing people talking about food and our environment and our health. So I started kind of reading. At the same time, I started watching Food Networks. I don't know about all of you, but I learned how to cook from Giada De Laurentiis and, all of the Food Network stars, as I started cooking when I was in college, and then gathering friends over to cook together. But it was really once I started working, and again, I was working as an accountant. I was working at the World Bank, and so I was surrounded by all of these people from around the world. And I remember being with friends and living in Washington, D.C., and my Spanish friends and my Italian friends were arguing over who had is it prosciutto or is it jamon, which is butter. And I just remember thinking, these are my people. I didn't know it. And then like my colleagues were from around the world, and so food was always a way that you could connect with other people. And then one specific story, I was traveling. We were looking at the kind of capacity for accounting in different countries. What's their education system like? Do they have, what support do they need to kind of develop accounting as a profession? And so I was in the Gambia in Western Africa, and I remember I took a photo of it so I can picture it still. This stew that I had that was okra based, tomato based, and it had a chicken leg on top. And I had been to New Orleans several times growing up with my grandparents. And I realized, oh, this is what I've heard about. This is the West African okra tomato-based stew. If you added a roux, which is the French component, you would have gumbo. And I remember hearing New Orleans cuisine is this amalgamation of the French influence, the West African influence from the slave trade, and all of these other things. And I remember, and I was like, I'm eating history. I'm eating globalization, and I'm seeing it. And that kind of sparked this interest. So I decided to shift careers, and I went back to grad school and studied food anthropology. So I think the story that I just told is a great example of looking at the stews. So food anthropology it's a way of understanding and studying the world through the lens of food. So thinking about things like traditions and culinary heritage, people and our relationship with food. But I think as that kind of since living in San Francisco, and my career has really shifted to where I'm looking at not just the history of food, but the future of food. What is it that traditions and culinary history tell us about innovation and what we might do differently in the future? How do we think about the power dynamics in our society and the ways in which our food system has created some of the problems that we have today, not just in food, but globally? If we look
Yeah.
at the economic system, if we look at our health, a lot of those challenges come back to food. And so it's just the lens through which I look through the world. And that's in a nutshell what food anthropology is. But I could talk for hours about that. So if you ever find me and see me around,
Yeah.
we could talk more about that.
Well, again, like we talked about this potentially being like several part series, right? Because we have so much to cover. But I think,
Yeah, there's a
one
lot
thing
to
that
cover.
there is, but one thing that you did mention about like your career path specifically was sort of this like nonlinear journey. And I think that can be really scary for some folks, right? Where you feel like, oh, I've made a real wrong turn. But, I'm just curious from your experience prior to joining the ISS Guckenheimer team and your nonlinear career path, any like big like aha moments, big learnings that you can share with us?
I think so. There's a woman that I've come across. Her name is April Rennie, Rinne,
Mm-hmm.
and she's written a book and has talked a lot about this idea of a career portfolio, which I think is in hindsight, that's a lot of what my career has been. We often talk about a career path, which is very linear. And her argument is if you think about something like your investments, you tell people diversify, invest in a lot of different things. We're going to be talking about biodiversity today. So, diversity is good. And thinking about a career portfolio is really thinking about what are the variety of experiences that I've had and that I would like to have that both enable me to learn, but also tap into my skills. So I think that has been helpful for me in kind of understanding my career in that way. But for me, I think the big aha was, and I kind of had to live through it. I'm 40, so I've been working for 10, 15 years. And it's taken me a while to realize how my brain works, what it is that my skill set is, how it differs from other people, and now I can articulate better what it is that I do differently or uniquely and what others are better at than I am. And some of that just took doing it. It just
Mm-hmm.
took having experiences and learning along the way. So for me, I think focusing on always challenging and learning and having that kind of openness and that curiosity has allowed me to find. Now I can see the connections. A lot of people say anthropology and accounting; those are two totally different things. My brain doesn't see it that way. They're both different forms of systems thinking. When you're an accountant, you're looking at individual transactions. There's different rules that you can kind of apply in different ways. And you're looking at these transactions to say, what's the story of this company over the last quarter, over the last year?
Mm-hmm.
Anthropology is the same thing. You're looking at that stew in the Gambia and saying, what does the stew tell me about the larger world? So to me, one just uses numbers and one uses food, but otherwise it's the same thing.
I love it. I think it's just so inspiring the way that you've sort of embraced this non-linear diversity of experiences, really. And so I think, a challenge to all of us, sometimes if you're feeling a little bit nervous about your career path, like be bold, be curious, and enjoy the journey, right?
Yeah. And I will say we hear about imposter syndrome. That's real. I there, especially earlier in my career, I was working at Institute for the Future, which is a nonprofit kind of strategic foresight agency. So basically, companies and nonprofits and governments will hire an organization like Institute for the Future to help them think about what's the future of work, what's
Mm-hmm.
the future of food. And so my focus was future of food. So I was working with a lot of the really big companies, and I felt like, what do I know about the future of food? These people are executives. They've been working in this industry for a long time. And I struggled with, I said yes to everything because I felt like I needed to do every single project, and
Yeah.
I got burned out from that. And so again, I think some of that some of it is just you go through and you get enough experiences that you feel like, wait, I do have something to say. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
everything. I think a lot of sort of getting older and going through a career is really learning that I don't know everything, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And I also have experiences that I can tap into that might be different from other people. But it's not all rosy. I've definitely had times where I'm not an expert in sustainability. What? No, like, and I still feel that way quite often. So just to say that's always there. And you sometimes have to just kind of, I think, have some grace with yourself
Mm-hmm.
and recognize that all of us have something that we can bring to our careers and to the people around us, and just finding that and then recognizing when we're being a little too hard on ourselves.
Oh, 100% wholeheartedly agree. So thank you. Now, you are the Director of Sustainability Innovation for ISS Guckenheimer.
Mhm.
One of your key focus areas is biodiversity. Can you explain, like, why is this such an important focus area for us right now?
Biodiversity, it touches on so many different aspects of our world. One of the ways that again, you can tell I explain things a lot through stories. But this is an example that I love to share, which is that some people on the call may have heard of a statistic that's often quoted. It's from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Interestingly enough, they have not really given a solid like, I don't know where this data point comes from, so I sometimes question it. But the data point is that 75% of the world's calories are generated from just 12 plants and 5 animal species. And when you think about it, in a lot of ways that does make sense, because if we think about calories, a lot of calories in diets around the world come from corn, soy, rice,
Mm-hmm.
and it's from kind of two things: either in some of this sort of lower income parts of the world, these are cheap and affordable and available foods that do provide a lot of calories. But then at the same time, you have, through the industrialization of the food system and the creation of a lot of processed, highly processed
Yep.
foods, they rely on these sort of as cheap calories and as a way of producing food cheaply. So this is, we know that we're getting a lot of our calories from a small amount of plants and animals. Well, I was reading a book called The Food Explorer. It came out a few years ago, and it's about the story of a man named David Fairchild, who was a botanist, who in the early, kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, he basically kind of helped by a very wealthy funder, started this kind of new role within the USDA, where he went around the world and found foods, found seeds. Sometimes he was authorized to take seeds. Sometimes he and the team would like go onto people's farms and steal them. So again, some nefarious things happened. But basically, they would send samples back to the USDA for testing. Could these crops be grown in the U.S.? And one of his colleagues was a man whose last name was Meyer. So if you've ever had a Meyer lemon, it comes from this group at the USDA. But I was reading this book and I was just shocked because I came across a quote from one of his memos. So this is early 1900s, and he said, I have the quote here: "The menu of the average American dinner includes the product of scarcely a dozen plants, and yet the number which could be grown for the table would reach into the hundreds." So I was thinking, okay, we've got the FAO saying most of our ingredients come from about 12 plants. Over 100 years ago, we had this man saying the average American at the time, their food comes from about 12 plants. And he made it his life's mission to go out and find new ingredients. So how is it that 100 years later, we basically ended up where he was? And that's a really good example of, when you go back in time, you can kind of understand what's happened. A lot of what's happened is colonialization, industrialization, a focus in farming on high yield, on growing large monocrop crops on farms. And so what that has meant is that there are all of these wonderful foods around the world that are adapted to a local environment. They're very nutritious, they're good for the soil, they're good for ecosystems, but they've been underdeveloped, underutilized, undervalued, because the kind of the growth of the global food system and our current model has only valued and invested in a handful of
Mm-hmm.
these crops. And so what that means is that you have traditions and farming communities around the world that, a lot of traditions have been lost. And then you can also see the impact in our health. So recently, a couple of years ago, I think it was 2020, the Rockefeller Foundation did a report looking at the cost of food in the US. And they used 2019 data. And they found that Americans spend about $1.1 trillion a year on food. And that's growing food, processing it. When we all go to the grocery store, $1.1 trillion a year. And what they found is if you actually consider the environmental damage, and the biggest issue was diet and related disease and the healthcare costs to care for those illnesses, we actually spend $3.2 trillion a year. So we say our food, we're spending $1.1 trillion on our food, but then $2 trillion we're spending through care for mostly through healthcare. And so this is an example where the lack of diversity in diets can translate into other problems. And then just last year, the UN, they had like an annual kind of state of food report, and they did this globally, and they found that globally we spend about $10 trillion a year on food, and a lot of that is the healthcare cost. So this is why, again, like you talk about biodiversity, and kind of depending on who you're talking to, people might have an environmental angle on why it's important. Somebody might be really interested in the health angle. We're a community of food people. I'm really interested in what cuisines, like I see biodiversity as there's so much possibility if we're thinking about flavor and we're thinking about texture and all of the Meyer lemon tastes so different from other lemons. What other lemons am I missing out on?
Right.
I'm a lemon person. And so that's why I think it's a really great, again, when you look at the world through the lens of something like biodiversity and food, you actually understand a lot about the way the world works, the problems we have, and what do we need to do differently to not just recreate the same problems and to create a better future.
Absolutely. And so, we were talking a little bit about, what is happening at the global level. You and I had briefly spoken about like the Future 50 Foods list. So can you just mention a couple of things about Future 50 Foods, what that is, how that might be a helpful resource to us? And then, any other big efforts that are taking place to preserve and support greater biodiversity around the world?
Yeah, so the Future 50 Foods list is a list that was developed by WWF, so an environmental kind of conservation nonprofit, and Knorr, which is a brand that's part of Unilever. And it's a list of 50 plant-based foods, and it includes things like algae, different cereals, tubers, and sprouts. But the criteria they use to create this list is that these are foods that are beneficial to human and planetary health, and they have the potential to be affordable. And what I love about it is it's catchy, Future 50, but they didn't lead with, these are plant-based, or I love how they led with, this is about the future, and this is about creating a better future. And what I find really interesting about this report is some things are things that a lot of us probably do eat. There's, kale is in there, but there's also some things that maybe are less common depending on the cuisines that you like and like to eat or where you live. Things like different kinds of millets. And so I think they've translated a lot of complexity into something that's really digestible. One of the things that I've thought about is there are 52 weeks in the year. You could take this Future 50 Foods list, or whether in your personal life or in your role as a chef or in your role in our company, and say, each week I'm going to try a different food. And so when you look through the Future 50 Foods list, and when you go to the grocery store, or you're thinking about what to cook, or you're sitting at a restaurant looking at a menu, familiarize yourself with this list, because then you'll see something on the menu and say, oh, I think I want to try that. I know it's part of that Future 50 Foods. So they've really tried, I think they've kind of helped condense that complexity down into something that's pretty actionable. And I know that you actually have been using the Future 50 Foods list in your work as well.
We have, yeah. So in our teaching kitchens, we have committed in 2024 to utilizing at least 35 of the Future 50 Foods. And I think that, while we were doing this, one, we obviously wanted to celebrate traditions, regional cuisines, and cultures. But we also are taking a look at what are some of the guest favorites? What are people already eating that they like? And what are some easy ways that we can integrate some of these ingredients that we might not have thought of, but are actually pretty easy to integrate into some of these recipes? And so, those are some of the approaches that we are taking, and we're finding it really, really successful. And the guests are just so excited. They're like, yeah, of course, I want to eat foods that are good for me and good for the planet. And this is easy and delicious. So it's a win-win-win.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit more about, what we as individuals can do, because I think we're talking a lot really big picture. So if we zoom in on ourselves as team members of ISS Guckenheimer, but also as consumers, what are some of the recommendations that you would say? I know you said, maybe as you're eating out, but any other research or, just ways that we can approach this?
I mean, definitely trying new foods, and encouraging others to try new foods, especially, those of you on the call who are culinarians. A lot of what you can do is make something enticing, that to people, and make it taste really delicious. So sort of, I think having that curiosity and being intentional around whether it's the Future 50 Foods list, or maybe there are other things. We're seeing, I find it really interesting in grains. The sort of farm to table movement is now happening in grains. In the way that you've seen single origin coffee, single origin chocolate, that's happening now with grains, where people are talking a lot about varietal integrity. So it's not just corn, it's bloody butcher corn, which is an heirloom style of corn. And then you can go to a store and buy a bag of bloody butcher corn. So if you're into grains and bread baking, and that's an area that's kind of exploding right now. And then I would say, whether it's things that you might be preparing in your work or in supporting an account, if you're in procurement, things you're seeing on a procurement list you haven't seen before, or in your personal life. I love to recommend kind of reading up on a particular food. There are books on, there's a historian who's written a book about salt. He's written a book about cod. I've read a book about collards. But actually, whenever you take one ingredient and either read a book or read some articles about that ingredient, then you can kind of unpack what is the role of this ingredient in our global history. What are some challenges with that ingredient today? What are farmers doing differently? And that will kind of make it kind of helps you think about how this one ingredient sort of, what kind of food system is this ingredient the product of, and what kind of food system could this ingredient support if we were to grow it in a different way, or if we were to grow more of it, because we currently don't grow enough of it. I mean, buckwheat is one example. You see some trend reports. It's going to be the year 2024 is going to be the year of buckwheat. One of the reasons that's happening is, well, it's gluten-free. It's pseudo grain. So that ties into, again, kind of some things that are happening on the food culture side. But a lot of farmers, if they're looking at transitioning their farming to regenerative approaches, buckwheat is very good for the soil. So again, you can kind of start to see that trend doesn't just come out of anywhere, out of thin air. It's this connection between what farmers are doing for their soil, and also this kind of larger exploration of grains and gluten and intact grains and those kinds of things. So I think read a little bit about how that ingredient was grown and its history, and that will kind of help you understand and appreciate it differently.
Yeah. And I think, sometimes we forget, folks in the food industry or culinarians, we forget that the significant role that we really play in shifting diets and helping transform the food system. I think guests, and especially with the internet and social media, more than ever are looking towards chefs to be influencers, right? To be explaining, hey, here's an ingredient. This is why I'm excited about it. And here are some fun ways that you can use it. You should try it, right? And so I think, again, a challenge to all of us, no matter the different part of the organization that we work in, we're all food people. We all have this knowledge. We can do the research. We can learn more. And we can kind of step up and be those influencers to help and do our part in the shifting of diets, right?
Yeah. And I would push, I think this is one of the things I'm excited about working with ISS. I think the culinary world has done so much to work on shifting diets and to sort of think about plant-forward eating and some of these things. And I think there's so much more to do on that. I would challenge people to learn a bit more about the upstream side of the supply chain. A lot of what we can do as people who buy a lot of food and create recipes is to understand, I mentioned buckwheat as an example. What is it that growers and farmers, what is it that they're trying to do? What is it they need to do to improve soil health, to improve our environment in the face of climate change? And we have a role to play in that as well. So I think, our organization and culinarians kind of sit between the farmer and the eater in a really interesting way. So I would also challenge everyone, talk to a couple of farmers or read up on regenerative agriculture, read up about soil health, and kind of understand how the ingredients you choose also support farming communities and our climate.
I love that. Well, this 30 minutes has gone extremely fast. Rebecca, we do have a couple of questions. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to take those questions. We can answer them and add them back into the chat box. But I want to say thank you so much. What an informative 30 minutes this has been. And hopefully we can do a part 2 and expand on these things a little bit more.
That sounds great. I would love to.
Yes, Shannon agrees, way too fast. But thank you again so much for sharing with all of us, for inspiring us. I'm excited to go look at menus, investigate, see what new options there are, maybe read a couple of books, and we'll talk more. I think we're going to have a part 2.
Sounds great. Yes, would love to.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. Rebecca, thanks so much for your time, and we'll see you next time. See you soon, everyone. Bye.